Yemen's death toll is growing after suspected US airstrikes in Sana'a killed at least 7 people and injured 29 on Monday, according to the Houthi rebels occupying the capital city. At least 123 people have been killed since the start of the intense airstrike campaign, launched nearly a month ago by President Donald Trump after the Houthis' retaliatory attacks against Israel's aid blockade of Gaza. The US military's Central Command did not acknowledge Monday's strikes and have also not provided information on the 200 strikes it says has been conducted so far, obscuring clear numbers of the civilian impact. But when 5 children were killed at the start of the US campaign, the main controversy was not civilian deaths so much as the accidental adding of a journalist to the signal group that coordinated the strikes. Yemeni civilians have long suffered as collateral damage of proxy and civil warfare, which has turned the country upside down for over a decade. Since 2015, Saudi Arabia has led a military campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, enabled by British and US weaponry, despite mounting evidence of thousands of civilians being killed and international protests against the supply of arms. Both US and UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia continue today, and currently the UK's biggest arms buyer, the UAE, faces accusations in the International Court of Justice of arming genocide in Sudan. As conflict intensifies across the Middle East, there are mounting questions about apparent impunity for state-sponsored civilian killings. How do nations, claiming leading status in international law and human rights, justify their role in mass civilian casualties? How are those decisions made? And how does civil society around the world hold their governments to account? One Middle East Eye reporter spent 2 years seeking answers to these questions, working alongside arms trade researcher Anna Stavrianakis. Joining us now is MEE investigative journalist Danya Akkad. Danya, welcome to the studio.
Hi, thanks for having me, Matilda. It's great to be here.
Now, your investigation begins with one of the deadliest single civilian airstrikes in Yemen, the Great Hall attack in October 2016. What happened during this attack, and why is it so significant in this story?
Yeah, so this attack was on a funeral in Sana'a. It was in an afternoon, and it was actually a funeral for the Houthi-led government's, the father of the Houthi-led government's interior minister, and there were over 1,000 people at this funeral in Sana'a. The date and place had been announced on. Can you not hear me? Sorry, we're okay. Go ahead. Okay. The date and place had been announced on Facebook, and when the strike happened, it happened in two stages. It's called what we call a double tap. So there was one airstrike initially, and then shortly afterwards there was another strike. And actually, according to Mawatana, a Yemen human rights organization that documented this, there may have been also a third strike, witnesses said. So 155 people were killed in the attack, and hundreds of others were wounded. And the thing is, the attack wasn't so unusual for the war in Yemen up until that point, in the sense that other civilian spaces had been hit, schools, factories, hospitals. So it wasn't unusual, but what was jarring about it and why Anna Stavrianakis and I focused on it was because of the scale of it. It was the largest single loss of life in the war. And so for the public and also for governments that were okaying exports of weapons to countries involved in it, it was jarring. And this is why Anna and I spent 3 years filing freedom of information requests with the UK government to try to get to the bottom of how this attack changed government policy or didn't. We wanted to know what officials were talking about after the attack happened, to know whether they were concerned that this was the moment that they should stop selling arms to Saudi. And so that's what our 3-year-long journey was about.
So this was the biggest single civilian casualty attack. But can you give us a sense of how much, how big the civilian impact has been over the course of the Saudi Arabian airstrikes in Yemen enabled by UK and US weaponry over the past 10 years?
Yeah, so between 2015 and 2022 March is when the Saudi-led coalition airstrikes stopped, and March 2015 is when it started. From then until then, according to the Yemen Data Project, 19,226 civilians were killed from airstrikes. So that's a lot. That's a lot of people.
That is a
It's a
lot
big
of
number.
people. And can you give us a sense now of how much the UK government has profited from these sales?
Yeah, so the UK, along with the US, is one of Saudi Arabia's leading arms suppliers. And it also is a major supplier, as you were saying before, to the United Arab Emirates, which was part of the Saudi-led coalition. And according to the Campaign Against Arms Trade, a figure that they put out last year, the published value, so the value that the government sort of puts on paper of what it sold to the Saudi-led coalition was 9.7 billion pounds. But CAT actually estimates that the real value is more than 29 billion pounds to Saudi alone, and nearly 31 billion in total to the coalition. And that has to do with open licenses and different kinds of licenses, but that's their estimate. So also quite a bit of money.
Thank you for breaking that down. I think that gives us a really clear picture of what we're looking at. Those civilian lives on the one hand, and the profits from arms sales on the other. Now, as you said, you have spent 3 years trying to understand how much the UK government knew about how their weapons were being used, filing FOI after FOI. That sounds like a lot of fun. What did you learn? How much
Yeah.
did they know, and why did they continue to provide them?
Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to back up here and just explain a little bit about how the government decides whether to license arms sales so that I can explain what we were actually looking for. So weapons, the UK government wasn't itself selling weapons to Saudi or the UAE. It was private companies, obviously. And the UK government was deciding whether or not these sales should be licensed. And so the government has this list of criteria. It's got a really cool name, the Strategic Export Licensing Criteria, SELC, people call it. I know this is the world's sexiest story, and it uses these criteria to decide whether it's going to okay an export. And one of the most important criteria, the criteria that comes up a lot for us in our reporting, is whether there's a clear risk that a government that the UK weapons are being sold to, whether there's a clear risk that those weapons might be used later in serious violations of international humanitarian law. So the measure is clear risk that weapons might be used. It's not even that weapons have been used, it's that they might be used. So clearly in Yemen, civilian spaces were being hit. And clearly US and UK weapons were being used by the Saudi-led coalition. So you had these two things going. And what Anna and I wanted to know was, how had the government assessed the risk of UK weapons being used in attacks that could hit civilians? How had it assessed it after this attack happened? And I guess we can talk a bit more about this, but we came to find out that we couldn't find out a lot about this, and that's problematic.
Right, I see. So I wanted to ask what proof there is that the UK government knew their weapons were resulting in such massive civilian casualties. It sounds like that was established knowledge. Am I hearing that right?
No, it was more that what they were assessing within the government was whether there was a clear risk that their weapons might be used. So uh, in terms of our investigation, I never came upon information that showed that the government had proof that its weapons were being used. Of course, I think definitely U.S. weapons were later established as being involved in that Great Hall attack. So there's all kinds of different forensic investigations that happened showing which weaponry was used where. But in terms of our investigation, I didn't find any proof per se that the UK government knew that its weapons had been used in the Great Hall attack. But what I was trying to establish was whether the fact that it had happened at all raised concerns about the sale of those weapons.
Okay, I see. But of course, global outrage at the Great Hall attack, while it did prompt Washington to block a major US weapon sale to Saudi Arabia, did not see the same consequences in the UK. As you detail in your investigation, the UK continued providing arms after this event. Why did the UK not follow the US's example here?
Yeah, that was exactly our question. And this is what prompted us to get into this, because so clearly it had been a different, or the Americans had been so public about their reaction to it, or at least public a little bit about what they thought, and they had made a change in their arms export. In their arms exports, and this hadn't happened on the British side, and so that was the question going into this. And after 3 years, I still can't really tell you why not.
I suppose that is the story then. The story
Yeah,
is that
yeah.
we can't trace this. And of course, this is something that should
Yeah.
be publicly accountable, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is the thing. This is one of those investigations where it was, we have this saying in Arabic, "Mafi jawab jawab." No answer is the answer. And we tried for 3 years to get a clear answer about how this attack may have changed exports, and we couldn't get that answer. We tried FOIAs, and then we went through the front door to ask these questions, and we couldn't get answers. But in the course of our reporting, or actually towards the end of our reporting, a civil servant came forward, a whistleblower, and actually published in the Guardian saying that he'd been on the inside when decisions were made about the Yemen during the Yemen war, and that in fact there was a high-level meeting in which it was decided that it was time to stop the exports, that the clear risk had been met, but that those sales continued anyway. One question that that Anna and I had was, well, was that the Great Hall attack when that happened, when that decision was made, but it was, put aside? We put that to the Foreign Office. We also asked the civil servant, Mark Smith, who put this op-ed out in the Guardian about all of this. And the Foreign Office didn't answer us on that. And Mark Smith didn't respond to a request for interview. So it's a lingering question. Mm-hmm. And I think what our investigation shows is just that we don't know as a public sometimes what's happening with arms exports decision making. And when I say as a public, I include MPs in that. So it makes it really hard for us to scrutinize and hold our governments to account when we don't actually know the details.
Okay, so we do know from Mark Smith's account that concerns were raised internally. And we do know that the US responded by, at least temporarily, stopping these arms sales. Did the government do anything in reaction to indications of the civilian harm being wreaked? Did you learn about any changes or decisions being made?
Yeah, so after 15 FOIAs, at the very last FOIA, we got like this long bit of emails. And in those emails, it became clear, one, that they were very concerned after the Great Hall attack had happened. And they said something like, I'm going to get the wording wrong, but it was something like, it's becoming a finely balanced exercise. So they were already concerned about Saudi Arabia's risks with international humanitarian law, even before this attack. So we learned that. And the second thing is, we know that this attack prompted officials to create what they called, again, I can't remember the exact terminology, but essentially a plan in case it was assessed that the clear risk had been met. So it shows you that they were very concerned and that they were preparing to, I think, potentially stop exporting or to make some kind of change to the exports. But as far as we can tell, that didn't happen. Why? We don't know.
Okay. In 2019, however, the UK was forced to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And this was because of legal action by civil society organizations. There were massive protests. But just a year later, those arms sales resumed. How did the government get away with that?
So this is a bit complicated, and I won't go into all the details of it, but essentially the High Court ruled that those sales could start again. And as I understand it, it's not so much that the High Court decided, went into all the details of what the government had assessed and marked its homework and said yes or no. It's that the High Court found that the government had done homework, that the government had a process for checking whether there was clear risk involved with weapons there was a clear risk that weapons could be used in the violation of international humanitarian law. The government assessed as it said it would, and therefore it could continue exporting arms. It wasn't so much the detail of it, but more the process of it that the High Court said okay to. So, yeah, that's what happened.
Okay. So civil society took action to hold its government to account and ultimately it was a legal technicality that overcame that. And journalists at Middle East Eye have spent several years trying to get transparency on what was actually happening, and you haven't succeeded. Is it fair to say that overall the process seems pretty murky, and accountability, especially as we look at the rising numbers of civilian casualties in Yemen, seems like a distant concept?
Yeah. I think there's a lot more transparency work that could be done about arms exports. There's not currently a dedicated committee within the government looking at this, and a lot of the MPs I've talked to over the course of the past couple of years are not well informed on what's going on, and are constantly asking questions and not really getting a lot of answers. And I think in the case of Yemen and in Gaza, it would seem clear to anyone in the public that civilians are not only at clear risk of being hit, but are being hit. And so for me, Mark Smith, who came forward, the civil servant who blew the whistle, was a really important voice. And, you know, even though Anna and I could never get exact clarity about what had happened behind the closed doors, I think it's important to continue asking these questions. And I think one last thing is that I think what Mark Smith made us realize, and how he described the culture of the Foreign Office with these arms export questions, is that it may be very hard to find a smoking gun when it comes to these topics. But yet again, I think we need to keep asking these questions if we're going to watchdog and hold people accountable.
And Middle East Eye audiences can be assured that Danya will continue asking those questions. Danya Akkad, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You can read Danya's full investigation with Anna Stavrianakis on our website, middleeasteye.net.